Okay, let's begin. Welcome, everybody. I'm Mari Margill with the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. I'm joined today by our Senior Legal Counsel, Thomas Lindsay. And this is our monthly webinar on developments in the rights of nature, featuring speakers from around the world who are leading advocates for the rights of nature in their countries and communities. Today, we are very excited to be able to hear from a leading advocate on the rights of nature from India. And before we introduce her and hear from her, I wanted to make several announcements. First is, this is a monthly webinar, and so next month we're happy to announce that we will be featuring the work of people in the Philippines who we've been doing some work with for some time. They've been working on national rights of nature legislation. They will be with us for the monthly webinar on September the 17th, which will be September the 18th in certain time zones. But we'll be getting more information out about that, and registration is now open. And the other thing that we're really happy to be able to announce is that we are going to be holding a global forum on October 1st and October 2nd. And of course, that will be virtual by Zoom, where we're co-hosting the global forum with Dignity Rights International, as well as the Global Environmental Rights Institute at Weiner University, Delaware Law School. The Global Forum will focus on the rights of nature and the human right to a healthy environment, and how those two legal rights are advancing around the globe and how they relate to one another. And it will feature advocates and academics and attorneys from different countries, including Ecuador and Australia and New Zealand and India, and other places where people are working to advance these rights and the kind of challenges and strategies and other things that they're encountering. So the information on the Global Forum will be soon available online through social media, through our newsletter. So if you want to stay up to date on those, if you want to learn about registering for those, and all of these events are free, please sign up for our newsletter, which is the best place to get those. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and or other social media like Twitter or LinkedIn. So we'll have more information about both of those events and registration coming up very soon. So we hope that you will join us. We think they're really important conversations. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please know that everyone is welcome to submit questions or comments in the chat box here on Zoom. Everyone will be kept muted during the course of the hour. We are going to record this presentation, so this will be available on YouTube and social media and our website. So again, getting our newsletter is a great way to find out that the recording has been put up online so that you can share that or watch it again. We're going to hear from our presenter, and then we'll be able to ask her some of these questions that have been written into the chat box. So we're divided this time up so that people can have some interaction during the course of the hour. Okay, so to begin, I'm really, really pleased to be able to welcome Shrishtee Bajpai. She is an activist and researcher from India. She is a member of the organization, and I'm going to pronounce this, I hope, correctly, Kalpavriksh, an environmental action group that began in 1979. So they've been around for almost 40 years, more than 40 years, with a focus on environmental awareness, education, campaign, litigation, and research. The organization has a very long history of being active at that intersection of social and environmental movements and supporting communities who've been challenging the dominant development discourse that thrives on the destruction of nature. Shrishtee joined the organization in 2016, and her research with the group is focused on documenting, researching, networking on radical alternatives to dominant systems of statism, of capitalism, patriarchy, and other forms of that concentration of power. Her specific focus of her work is on exploring indigenous, traditional, customary ways of living, of decision-making, of governance, and the underlying worldviews that support those. Her work also involves coordinating processes, which they call alternative confluences in India. And she's helping and coordinating a global process called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which aims at creating exchanges, synergies, cross-learning, dialogue, collaboration among various radical alternative and social ecological justice movements around the world. And what brought me to know her and her organization has been the work that she's been doing on rights of nature in India and in South Asia. She helped organize the dialogue on rights of rivers that was held in New Delhi in March. And unfortunately, because of the virus, I was unable to attend, but they had a really important conversation that's ongoing. And she's advocating for rights of nature and rights of rivers in India and the rest of South Asia. So that work is continuing. So please join me in welcoming Shrishtee. She's going to provide us a presentation in PowerPoint. Shrishtee, welcome.
Thanks, Mari. Thanks for that generous introduction. And thanks for having me here. And thanks for organizing these series of talks, which I think in post or COVID times are actually very, very crucial to talk about. And thank you all for joining in today. So I will share a PowerPoint. And just let me know, Mari, if you can see it.
Of course.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I will be talking about rights of nature in specific focus, with specific focus to India. And I'll just give you a brief overview of what I will be focusing on today. So the first thing that I want to probably highlight is the discourse of environmental governance in India and how that sets a background of why one needs to start talking about rights of nature, particularly in India and the rest of South Asia, and why it holds a certain kind of relevance here. And then I will be focusing a little on the judgments that came about, and more focus that I want to put in this conversation is unpacking those judgments and some of the important questions that they have raised, and what opportunities they open up for the future, and what can possibly be done to actually protect and conserve nature. So what does it really mean for our rivers and the rest of nature, and what it means for us as human beings as well. And then possibly some of the proposals that have come out from the dialogue that Mari just mentioned about. And these dialogues opened up also a possibility of doing a lot of work around some of these things. So this is what you can expect by me talking for next 20-25 minutes. And I would like now to straight jump into the conversation. So the crisis of environmental governance in India, as one can just try to bring it down to 5 major issues that one can see is first the colonial legacy. So India was ruled by the British for 200 years or more, and that pretty much set the kind of institutions, bureaucracy, and the governance system we ended up having. And the worldview of the colonial system was based on extractivism and removal of communities where they were the custodians, making them the encroachers. So that legacy also led to monoculture, plantations, commercialization of lands, forests, resources. And when India got its independence, it pretty much followed the same legacy and same mindset of going about and ensuring development for people at the cost of environment. But that is something that one has to question, or whether it really ensured development for people, which will come back later into the conversation. The second part is that there has been extreme regulatory failure in terms of environmental governance in India. So we have had only centralized decision making. Community participation has been completely ignored, and people who are the most affected have never people who have been most affected have never been really part of the decision-making processes. And the third is the neoliberal growth model that India adopted, especially after 1992, when the whole privatization came about in India. That dramatically changed the kind of growth model and the kind of fetishness to growth basically we had, and which meant that nature was an impediment to growth, and hence it had to be removed from the process and to lead to development. And then the other point is the limits to the judicial activism. One can say that there have been some very progressive and some very interesting judgments in the past, but those judgments have been limited in terms of not being able to effectively impact the legislature and the executive. So their impact has been very limited in terms of bringing about some radical changes in the environment discourse. And the last is that conservation has been assumed to be environmentalism, which basically means that we create a national park or a protected area, and that is primarily what all is about, that you can do about conservation. And this whole idea of conservation, of removing human beings, removing local communities from these places, from their own lands and territories, has just kind of absorbed the mindset of the entire bureaucracy and decision makers. So these are some of the critical environmental governance issues that one can see, and people who have been studying these things for a long time now see that has actually barred our whole governance criteria, which has resulted, okay, I guess my computer is hung. Just a second, that is what I was fearing, which will happen. Can you see now? Yeah. So the results have been the increased erosion of natural ecosystems like forest and stuff for mining and coal auctioning, over exploitation of resources for exports, and in total, total exploitation of livelihoods, culture, and physical displacement of tens of millions of people, and it is continuously happening. What one can say about these processes is also that there have been a number of resistance movements which have been trying to respond to these crises, to these onslaught on their lands and territories. And some of these local resistance movements actually changed the way the governance in India was, especially the environment governance. So right after the independence, we did not even have a Ministry of Environment and Wildlife. And some of these very important resistance movement, people-led movement like tree hugging movement in the northern part of India, or Save the Forest, Save the Human Beings movement in Central India. Some of these critical movements in the 1970s and 1980s led to some interesting provisions and several acts on wildlife and pollution and environment. I also want to highlight some recent attacks that have been unfolding in India in last 4 months, which again have a bearing on when we're talking about rights of nature. So a law called Environment Impact Assessment, a provision like that has been proposed to be further diluted, which is to ensure ease of doing business. There have been several coal auctioning proposal in ecologically. Can you see my screen? Marie, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. There have been several coal auctioning proposals in ecologically sensitive and biodiverse regions in the name of self-reliant India. And government is pushing for hydropower projects in biodiverse and critical wildlife habitats. There have been massive approvals for sand mining, there's privatization, and there is like a whole mafia working there, and there's no control. It's completely reckless. there's a crackdown on environmental activists, people who are young people who are protesting against these completely reckless and destructive proposals by the government are further, facing responses, their reactions in ways that websites are their websites are banned, and people are being picked up. So it's actually the whole idea of diluting the spaces of democratic participation. And I think that is at a very critical, when we're talking about rights of nature, these aspects of governance, these aspects of intersectionality are very, very crucial. And that's why I want to highlight them. But now I want to move forward, and I'm sorry about this PowerPoints, but okay. I guess it's better if it's like this, just in case, because I think it's hanging when I'm putting it full screen. So the crisis of river in India and South Asia, I just want to briefly mention this because we are getting into understanding the rights of rivers that were granted in India. And before we get into that, a little bit of background about the crisis of rivers in India is important. So the rivers, the whole South Asian region is actually rich with rivers, and hundreds and millions of communities are fed by these rivers. And what crisis we see is the pollution, excessive pollution of rivers, and urban rivers are in fact most polluted. There's damming and diversions. Government is proposing new interlinking projects, sand mining, privatization. It's a new thing, but it's extremely dangerous for rivers. Riverine conflicts between neighboring countries, the recent one being with Nepal and Bangladesh, which are one of very important partners in this process, whereas the government's responses to most of these conflicts has been extremely authoritarian. And climate change and encroachments, and also one aspect that is not really usually looked at is underlying inequalities. And Indian society is quite unequal and unjust in many ways, and so these underlying inequalities further add to the marginalization of people and limit their access to use of resources. So who really gets the access is determined by the position you have in the society. So these crises sort of bring us to the juncture where we realize that the current discourse of environmental governance in India has basically failed to protect and conserve nature. Instead, the environmental laws and policies have been used as means to sanction the environment destruction, thereby resulting in legislations which are basically environmental clearances and a convenient facade. They're not really changing or transforming the systems, and they're just being used to sanction destruction. And now coming to the main part of this dialogue is why we're talking about rights of nature. So 2 years ago in 2017, the Uttarakhand High Court, which is one of the North Indian states in India, ruled that the Indian rivers Ganga and Yamuna, the Gangotri and Yamunotri glaciers, this is where the rivers originate from, as well as the other related natural elements are legal persons with all corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities of a living person. Subsequently, in 2018, the same High Court ruled that the entire animal kingdom has equivalent rights to that of a living person. And as recently as March 2020, the Punjab and Haryana High Court, which is also one of the North Indian states, passed an order declaring the Sukhna Lake in the Chandigarh city as a living entity, also with rights equivalent to that of a person. So these judgments, as you see, have come about in last 3 years, and they have not significantly changed much of the discourse in terms of destruction to nature, but they have opened up some opportunities and questions that I will be reflecting on in just a few minutes. but also to just look at what's happening in the neighboring countries. So in 2019, the Turak River in Bangladesh, Dhaka, was accorded legal person status by the High Court. And the verdict was later made applicable to all the rivers in Bangladesh. And similar attempts have been made in Nepal and Pakistan, where Nepal is thinking of granting rights to Mount Everest, and Pakistan is thinking of granting rights to the River Indus. And these, why mentioning these neighboring countries is important, because they have quite a bit of an implication of what happens to rivers, and where this actually all interconnected. And as we have been seeing, if people have been following the series which are being conducted by Murray and team, we know that like last time we heard a participant from Ecuador talking about the rights of nature discourse and how it emerged and what it means. And there have been similar processes happening in the US. Murray and team has been very active. Colombia, Bolivia, New Zealand, Mexico, and many others. New Zealand is particularly would be interesting for us to look at, because the New Zealand judgment quite a bit inspired the Indian judgment, and the judge quoted quite a few paragraphs from the New Zealand law. Sorry, it was not a judgment, it was a law. And importantly, what these judgments tell is that there are many indigenous communities and other nature dependent communities across India and rest of the world who have been talking about rest of nature, not particularly in the language of rights, but in the language of ethic of care, reciprocity, love, co-independence with the rest of nature. And they've been practicing that in their ways of being, in their ways of life. And so that is a larger background of how people relate with nature, which has been sort of shunned off by the kind of neoliberal and capitalist policies that we've been adopting. Now, I want to raise some questions that the judgment raises and poses in front of us, that actually a lot of us have thought about, but they all need much more deliberation. So the first question is, what is a river? And what all constitutes a river? So is a river just a flow of water, or is it more than that? What does it mean for a river and its associated natural elements to have rights? So when you accord rights to river, what does it really mean for them? When we accord rights to them as a person, what does that mean for rivers again? And how would such rights be implemented? We have never done that before in history, giving rights to nature. So how would those rights be implemented? Our institutions are not designed to think about nature. And so how do we change them? And they would not be able to claim or defend their rights, because this is a system which is anthropocentric. So how do we listen to them? How do we hear them? And who claims their rights? And what implications do these two decisions and the rest that are coming about in the world as well have those on people who are dependent on them, who are living along them, and what their relationship, and what does it tell about their relationship? How do we understand that? And continued, and I think which is an important part, which I'm not reflecting in this conversation, but I think it is important to reflect for all of us who are working towards this, this idea, is that with the law that has been largely used as a means to sanction will be able to resolve the contested articulation of relations between humans and the non-human, between culture and nature, and between development and environment. So is the law the right, or is the law the only way to look and resolve these contested articulations? I want to raise some questions here. And before I raise that, I want to just take you through to the judgment, because I don't know if people joining here have had the time or chance to look at the judgment. So these are two important quotes from the judgment. So the first I'll just read it out, the first one. The rivers, forests, lakes, water bodies, air, glaciers, springs have a right to exist, persist, maintain, sustain, regenerate their own vital ecological system. The rivers are not just water bodies, these are scientifically and biologically living. So this is a very, very important point. Courts usually don't talk like that. They don't recognize nature as living. Um, they don't recognize that the nature had the right to exist and persist. So this is a very different kind of a connotation that you get from this judgment. I also briefly would like to say that it is not that this is one of the first ecocentric judgments that was passed in India. There have been series of them. There have been very few, but there have been that discourse that that we shouldn't consider that this is just out of the blue. There are series of some judgments that have been recognizing the rights of local communities, their indigenous worldviews, like one in in um, in South in South India, where indigenous communities' rights were recognized. And the second para, if you want to look at, the court invokes, we by invoking parents' partridge jurisdiction, declare the glaciers, including Gangotri and Yamunotri, this is where the rivers originate, the river streams, rivulets, lakes, air, meadows, dales, jungles, forests, wetlands, grasslands, all of that as legal entity, legal person, artificial person having the status of a legal person. Now here, the court basically gives right to everything that comes to mind when you're thinking about the ecology around river. And so it goes from air to springs and waterfalls. What does it really mean? It doesn't really get into. There are some provisions in the Indian Constitution that the judgment raises about, that judgment cites. One is the directive principle: the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment. So the judgment talks about the directive principles and the state's responsibility to work towards that. It also evokes fundamental duties, that the Indian citizen has a right to protect natural environment, including forests, lakes, and rivers. And keeping these and citing these two in mind, the court makes its argument that it makes sense to give rights to rivers because the state has a responsibility, and so do the citizens of this country. Before getting into highlighting and talking a little more about the issues, would also like to show you, for audience who is not familiar with the rivers Ganga and Yamuna. So Ganga is a river that feeds actually 400 million people. It starts, can you see on the screen, it starts here, that's the glacier. It goes all around here and then crosses to Bangladesh and then Bay of Bengal. So it does a long journey, a really long journey, and so does the Yamuna River. And these are huge rivers. Ganges is one of the longest rivers in India, and they are not just ecologically very important, but they're also very sacred to communities. It's a sacred river to Hindus, and the logic that the court actually cites quite a bit in the judgment, which I will reflect upon a little later. The river is also very, very important for many other diverse communities that live along with it. So that's the significance. It's a lifeline for the northern part of India. These are just some photos for you to get a sense of how beautiful these rivers and ecology are. So the Ganga River in the Himalayas, where it originates, and then the river when it has gone through a long journey and reaches the east of India in Bihar. And issues with the judgment, I guess the key part of the talk here. So one, I think, is that the judgment doesn't define the river. The most difficult task is what is a river, and what are the river rights and duties. So what would be the rights of the species in the rivers? What would be the rights of the forest, and would they have the right? Doesn't specify the issues of implementation. What is the role of the dependent communities? Issues of guardianship. So the judgment talks about that there will be state representatives, the chief secretary of the state would be the guardian. And then in the later part of the judgment says that some communities who are there could also be part of the guardianship, but doesn't really include a more robust decision making or a more robust guardianship. And if people who would be aware about the New Zealand judgment, which has the more bottom up process of 150 years of indigenous EV people fighting for their rights, for granting or recognizing their deep intrinsic relationship with the Wanganui River, there the guardianship is much more robust. It doesn't define violations. It doesn't really talk about is damming a violation, is diversion a violation, because I guess that's where it gets complicated and it gets confrontational, and that's what the court doesn't do. It doesn't define compensation, restitution, and why these aspects are important, because the court is granting the rights to reward as a person. And if I, as a person, had certain rights, these, if an injury can be recognized and it can be proved, then I would have the right to get a compensation and restitution. But those aspects are not at all explored or not at all commented upon. I think one important point is about cross-boundary issues. So a river Indus, which flows between 3 countries from Pakistan, India, China, what does it mean to give rights to river in India? And it also flowing to other countries. So these cross-boundary issues are not reflected upon, and also within the country. So the Ganga River originates in these glaciers, flows to one state, which is Uttarakhand High Court, and then flows to other states. But what will be the governance situation in different states? It doesn't get into exploring that. Potential misuse, which I was mentioning about, that the only, and these are very long paragraphs where the judge tries to, the judgment gives quite a significant reason that, well, the river Ganga is sacred to Hindus, and we must recognize our relationship, and that is why grant rights to the rivers. There's no doubt or contestation about that, but with the current political situation in India, which is complex, which is about the domination of one religion, it can take various turns, and we as people who are looking at intersectionalities have to be cautious if it could raise questions of certain misuse. And what has happened in the past, that certain laws have been passed and which have actually been used as means to restrict the rights of the most marginalized and vulnerable communities who have been dependent on those natural entities or rivers for this matter. And we have to be careful whether this law could be misused as that. So just a careful side to that also. And it shouldn't end up being a technical fix, something that you just pass and to correct some technical fixes, but it has to be much more robust. And there is no local people-led movement for this judgment. So I also want to especially mention that this judgment, these two, in fact, granting rights to animal kingdom, granting rights to Ganga and Yamuna, and granting rights latest by Punjab and Haryana High Court to Satna Lake, all 3 judgments are given by one judge. So we can, which tells us that there is one judge who is critically changing certain things and is concerned about it, but he's just one judge. So does it really transform things? We will have to see. So there are certain proposals that, as Murray was mentioning about, that we had a dialogue this year with this lot of confusion around what do these judgments mean? Can we use them in a way that we can actually protect nature? What would it mean? And so this dialogue explored a few questions. One was, what is a river? So would it mean that the Gangetic dolphin, which is endangered, could also have rights or would also have rights? Gangetic gharial, which is again an endangered species, would also have rights. Would catchment areas have rights? Would the forest around, what would be the stretch of the forest? Would the dependent communities have rights, and how those rights would be defined, and how we would look at them in conjunction. So some of the deliberations that are of a collective that I'm sharing right now is, what is a river? So what, as people working on river issues and people working with the dependent communities for many years, that the kind of exploration that emerged was that a river includes aquatic flora and fauna, the biodiversity in its catchment areas, forests, its tributaries, groundwater, the rocks and the soil in its bed and banks, and the human communities immediately dependent on it, especially those communities who are based on localized subsistence-based human needs. And so the rights of rivers in that sense would mean all the ecological causes and conditions making up the natural habitat of the river that need to be maintained so that the river's integrity and identity is maintained. What would be the rights? And so the rights would be the right to flow unhindered, so no dams and diversions, the right to meander, to flood its floodplains, also to include the soil and groundwater flow, because that is something that has been significantly impacted and needs to be part of the rights of rivers. Right of a river should also include the rights of all that determine the health of the river, I was earlier mentioning. Hence, the species in the river, the basin, and the catchment areas would also have rights. And one participant who very interestingly mentioned about a community that he works with, that the river has a right to flow, to play, and to feed. And that is what the communities believe in. So can we have those connotations of rights? And if some of you, I don't have it right here, but if some of you have also looked at the Universal Declaration of Rights of Rivers, those are the 6 rights that were also discussed, and some crucial right to life, right to exist, right to maintain its ecological balance. What would be the duties? So do rivers also have corresponding duties? Yes, but natural duties corresponding to natural rights. What would be those natural duties? How do we define natural, and how do we unpack the duty? Would be very important, because does the river have a duty to feed or to provide energy to millions of people? So those lines and thoughts and ideas need to be discussed. We could think quite a bit about the implementation and the kind of system we could have which can ensure that these rights can actually work on the ground, and to have a democratic system of custodianship that could serve the purpose of safeguarding the interest of the rivers and also the interest of the community, and a more consultative process that involves multiple set of actors, and it's not just the decision makers sitting in Delhi, but people so basically a multi-scale or a nested institutional frameworks that can involve people like you and I, people like communities, people like lawyers, experts, and people who are concerned about these issues, and as well as state representatives. So how can we have a more robust institutional systems rather than just a centralized, extremely bureaucratic systems? What are the violations? I think that is very, very important to define, because violations could be anything and not also anything. And that is what the judgment also does. The violations of rights of rivers is basically any obstruction or impediment that disables the entity from performing its essential ecological functions, and if it violates its existing rights. And for compensation and restitution, some of the ideas were how can we undo the violations? And folks who are joining from the US can also tell that there have been proposals of decommissioning dams. So can we decommission dams? Can we remove the obstructions and impediments? Can we put immediate stop to the ongoing projects and processes that will hamper the ecology of the river? And one thing that is crucial is that can we compensate the communities that are affected and are at the chance of losing the most when any natural destruction happens? So a common fund, that is a proposal, a common fund for this with specific institutional mandate could set up. And again, for something like that, we need a nested institutional framework. So these are some of the deliberations that came out of the dialogue. Of course, it's a very, very long process and needs to need more exploration and unpacking and a lot of movement. But I think for important questioning that is required by people like all of us who are working towards this rights of nature discourse is first questioning the development and growth model, because I don't think that the rights of nature discourse can go together with the fetishness to growth or development that we have that thrives basically on destruction of nature. The kind of centralized political nation state oriented governance model that removes communities and indigenous peoples from any decision making processes. The legal framework, which is presently anthropocentric and Western and is not really inclusive of people's notions and people's worldviews and customary ways of laws and beings. And eventually we'll have to move beyond rights, because rights is an opening to significant change, but there's for radical transformations to come about on the ground and to really change the way we see the rest of nature, we need to go beyond rights. And so this is my last slide. Apologies if I've gone too long. So what lies ahead? Lots of things. One, at least this is very specific to India and South Asia, is that there's lots of awareness and campaigning and advocacy that is required. And a lot of discussion, as we have also earlier had, is on the potential legal and policy strategies, because it's not really easy to go about articulating a law like this. So we need a clarity on a number of things. And using international law like Convention of Biodiversity, Migratory Species, Ramsar Conventions to argue for legal rights of rivers, which could supersede national law that is in contravention or where there's doubt. Relationship of customary and traditional law with any such law needs to be studied more, needs to be included more. The language of rights could be very exclusionary. And so we have to also think about how communities' worldviews are also very much part of this discourse. We need a lot of groundwork from this and a lot of education, cultural, religious, and media and other such modes, or start talking about in a language of earth justice, rights, nature, which doesn't really go beyond our circles. And another important aspect that in these times has become very crucial, because India is currently facing quite a bit of a conflict with its neighboring countries, be it Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, and now Nepal. I think we have to reimagine our governance from ecological point of view. So can we think about bioregions? Nature doesn't really exist in form of the nation state boundaries. It is contiguous. So can we really change that governance system that we have? And supporting the local processes of lake revival, can we have Bill of Rights? Can we have river protections, support groups where this concept can be supported, introduced, and there are some attempts being made there as well by some activists. So this is about a long journey that, or one can say this is a long river ahead of us. And if we keep moving, we'll reach somewhere, but let's keep moving. So thank you very much. And thank you for your patience. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee. That was really, really, that was so great and really, really informative. Thank you. And I really appreciate just how complex the situation is in India, and everywhere, but you really drew that out. And we have some questions along that line. So the first, I hope, is an easy question, which is are you okay with us sharing your PowerPoint with participants today after we're done? Okay, so we will follow up with people and be able to share that. The second question, and you spoke a little bit about this, but there's been several questions related to it. So I wanted to ask, you talk about communities What do you see, or what is the thought that you're having about the role of communities in recognizing rights of rivers and their role potentially as guardians or custodians to monitor and enforce and implement those rights?
I guess the first step towards that is recognizing that the communities are already doing that. They are protecting their lands, they are protecting their territories. The problem is that we are intruding in their territories. We are intruding in ways that that completely destroys them, that completely destroys their systems. So the communities have, we can be their allies, we can be their supporters in this process, but they are already, there are like hundreds of examples of community conserved areas, and there are hundreds of examples where people are fighting extractive industries, reimagining their governance models, narrating their own stories of how they relate to the rest of nature. So I guess the first step is how we can support these communities, how we can protect them, how we can support them in a way that we can take this language, which could be exclusionary, people don't understand the rights language, to a language and club it with people's language, with the way they articulate their connections with nature. How can we put that into our own understanding of law? How can law be more pluriversal, more comprehensive, more inclusive? So I guess we have to play that role of a middleman. I don't like that word, but we have to play that role of being a middleman, of resolving that conflict, that big gap between the law and people's way of relating with nature. So how can we bridge that gap? And I think that is where the biggest struggle lies for us, to articulate the customary ways into, or bring those ways into our legal systems.
Okay. And can you tell us, in terms of the dialogue and the ongoing work that you're doing, has there been consideration of what, many rights of nature laws include a right to restoration or full and complete restoration? What is your thinking about when you have dams on rivers, or deforestation around rivers? Has there been a discussion about what full restoration, or what that right to restoration might look like around the Ganga or other rivers in India?
I think, well, my knowledge on that would be a little limited because I have not extensively worked on rivers per se. But I think the laws have been, the restoration efforts have been very superficial, which is not really understanding the ecology of the river, or understanding what it really means to restore rivers. So it's scientific, which is in many ways devoid of local knowledge. And so the restoration might happen in name of planting certain trees that don't even fit in the ecology of the river. And the laws and the policies have been primarily in a form or in a way that that is just for the name's sake. So when a certain restoration program happens, it's basically a lot of money is put in the name of Namami Gange project, which is about we will do a lot of pollution drive and things like that. But then at the same time, you're also sanctioning a 4-lane project in the ecologically sensitive area like the Himalayas, which is resulting into massive destruction of the river. So where does your restoration lies? It's largely a facade, basically, where the restoration of the river is merely about putting a lot of money, and in the side of that, doing other destructive stuff.
Thank you for
And
that. Yes.
sorry, I just briefly also add that this is where my potential of misuse point is very crucial, because the current government can act, the use of religion in this context at points can be useful to make an argument about why we need to protect nature. But at the other point, it can extremely distort what is really protecting the river, because we are creating a 4-lane highway in the Himalayas to reach a temple which is sacred for many Hindus, but at the cost of destroying a sacred river. So that connections, those things are to be looked very carefully, and also to see how can they potentially really misuse the people's sacredness to natural entities. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's actually really, it's very important. I wanted to ask, I know that you do work at Intersectionality, and there's been several questions that have alluded to this, which is, what do you see about like the role of social movements in protecting the rivers and the rights of the rivers? And I'm thinking about potentially also, are there what we'd call non-traditional or unusual allies within social movements that might have an interest in this because of that intersectionality? It might be able to affect their work within social justice or economic justice, or in India, of course, right to water, right to hygiene. Those sorts of questions are always coming up. Can you speak a little bit to that role of different social movements engaging with this?
So this process this concept has to reach to many groups, even people who are working on environment issues, people who are working on river issues. So this concept per se has, in the language that we use, or in the language that we are talking right now about, it has not reached a lot of us until this judgment came about. And even after the judgment, there's lots of vacuum around it. And so what we need right now is much more dialogue within our own civil society groups of how we can use a provision like this. It's an interesting provision. It needs to be contextualized. It needs to be understood much more. But what it can be for us, and can it really lead to us in a world where our nature and ecology is protected, we have to see. But all of those things have to be unpacked as of now. But there is a long road ahead of looking at, so there could be like a lot of environment groups start working. I'm hoping maybe a lot of environmental groups in India and activist groups can start working on that. But the intersectionality part is still a long road ahead, because I guess as social movements and groups, we are so attuned to working in our own silos that it's very difficult to make those intersectionalities, or we don't want to, or we don't have the bandwidth to. I'm giving a benefit of doubt maybe there. But to look at issues of ecology as much as the issues of economic livelihoods and ecological livelihoods. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown that very much, that your destruction of nature is very much connected to your ecology, to your social aspects, to your cultural aspects. And so we have to look at life, or these issues, much more in a way that our life is basically is. So that's a long road ahead, at least in India. But I guess people are beginning to see that, and there's lots more conversations happening around that. And we hope to do that. At least in this dialogue we tried, there were people from very diverse backgrounds, from people who are working with grassroots social movements for land rights, to people who are academics or lawyers. So we try to make that intersection, and I think it can happen, and it will happen because these times have told us.
Okay, and one last question. I know Prime Minister Modi campaigned on cleaning up the Ganga, and there's been a lot of, well, noise around that. I don't know how else to say that, but can you just give us a sense, and this reflects some of the questions that have been asked as well, which is, can you just give us a sense of what, I guess, the general public in India, their understanding, their engagement, their concern for the health of the Ganga and other rivers? I mean, is that just like an ongoing public discourse and concern, or is that something that is more limited to, say, environmental groups?
Well, I think in general, people are concerned about the river because it's sacred to them, it's important to them. But there's also, well, this is something that that's my personal reflection on this, but I think that the way Ganga is seen as a mother who can absolve all your sins, as well as all the dirt that you throw on it, is some way at the crux of the crisis, which is you can keep throwing, dumping, keep destroying the river, but it is a goddess, and humans cannot supersede the goddess. So this underlying thing has sort of sort of taken over our mindset. But importantly, this is where I want to make a distinction between how people treat a river or think about a river, and how very secular discourses of bureaucracy and institutions actually result into the kind of setups that we have, where our sacredness is merely reduced to just going and praying at the river bank. But it is not more than that, because you are not part of the decision making. You are not part of deciding what happens at the river bank, what happens at the river front, or basically you're not really part and parcel of all the decisions that are being taken. And the secular discourses that have been inherited, I was saying as earlier also, the kind of colonial legacy we have and those inherited institutions have been merely about technical managerial fixes, primarily on modern science, that don't really respect people's sciences of protection of river, people's way of relating to river, but primarily relying on technical fixes of resolving the issues. So that doesn't give the opportunity, and even if people are concerned that there is that much that they can do to change the current condition of rivers. But Prime Minister Modi has used, or probably the restoration of the rivers was one of the main agenda for him coming to power. So you can understand the kind of sentiment people have for the river, but it's a very distorted vision, and I think some of us are also blind to not see how politics is being played out in the name of religion. The river is, at the end of the day, more polluted, more dammed, more diverted.
Thank you so much. That's really gives us I think, a pretty clear picture of just how complex that situation is. Shrishtee, thank you so much. I hope everyone can thank her. We will be sharing her PowerPoint. This has been really a tremendous presentation. Your knowledge surpasses everything I've learned about India. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So everyone help me in thanking Shrishtee. That was really terrific. Like I said, we'll have the PowerPoint out. We'll have this recording available online. So the best ways to know when that is available, and Thomas is putting that up into the chat, is signing up for our newsletter, and we'll let you know immediately. Following us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And the other good news that I have is, as I mentioned, we have our monthly webinars. So next month we'll be focusing on Philippines, so you can register for that now. And also, Shrishtee will be joining us on the October 1st and 2nd Global Forum that we're hosting with Widener Law School in Delaware and the Dignity Rights International, focusing on the rights of nature and that intersection with the human right to a healthy environment. So there's an opportunity to hear Shrishtee present again and engage with her again, which I think is really a delight. So we'll have more information about that very soon. So follow us again, online, newsletter, all of those things are ways to learn about that. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Shrishtee, this has been really remarkable. We so appreciate your time, and we're really looking forward to seeing you again in early October. And to everyone, thanks so much for joining us. It's so great to have everybody be able to join us today.